This webinar, How to Succeed in Mobile Games. So I will be the moderator. My name is Colin Contrary. I'm a product marketer at Embrace, which is an observability and debugging platform for mobile apps. And we are so excited to throw our hat into the mobile games ring because we recently have started supporting Unity. So I'm excited to be here. We've got two wonderful panelists excited to learn everything about the mobile game space and how they're able to succeed there. So let's meet our panelists. Let's start with you, Henry. Can you tell us a little bit about your history in mobile games and what you're working on now?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Colin. Happy to be here. Really excited about the panel. So yeah, my name is Henry. I'm currently the Chief Product Officer for One Team Partners, which is an athlete-oriented media company where we represent NFL players, MLB players, U.S. Women's National Team soccer players, MLS players, and WNBA players for their commercial rights, including licensing, content, marketing, and venture. I touch a lot of different areas of the business, but my background and why I'm on this panel is most recently in mobile games. Prior to joining One Team in May, yes, I took a job in the middle of the pandemic. I was at Scopely, where I was a very early employee. I joined Scopely in 2012 as the 23rd employee, ended up leading business development, which meant that I built out the studio ecosystem that Scopely is known for with studio partners, both external partners and wholly owned partners on 4 different continents. Also ran the licensing group, so working with brands from Star Trek and Marvel to WWE and Scrabble. And so have a lot of experience kind of in the business development partnership arena of mobile games. Also, in order to do my job effectively, when I was at Scopely and certainly now in more of a product-oriented role, spent a lot of time really trying to understand how games are made properly and what it takes to succeed. I built the strategy group at Scopely when I was there, so really trying to understand marketplace trends and where the puck is heading and how we can get there first. So it's a very exciting space. It's been a really dynamic one over the past 10 years, and hopefully I can learn something on this panel too, because there is an unending amount of stuff to be learned about mobile games.
Yeah, awesome. I'm so excited to delve into a lot of that. Let's meet our other panelists. Matt, same question. Can you tell us a little bit about your history in mobile games and what you're working on now?
Sure. Yeah, surprisingly to me, I've been in the industry for 16 years now, working on gaming, and I think about 11 in mobile. So I've worked at a kind of number of different mobile studios over the years. I started at Electronic Arts. I worked at Zynga, at Kabam, at Glue, and most recently at PurBlue. My kind of area of expertise is kind of a little bit of everything that has to do with design or production or product management. I've held kind of roles in all those areas. More recently, I've been an executive and been I was a VP of mobile at Kabam and ran kind of helped found the mobile business there and grow it out. At Glue, I was the chief product officer and ran studios around the world and had a fairly big org. And then at PurBlue is a much smaller studio, kind of in a more hands-on chief product officer role. We're about 60 people. PurBlue specializes in RPG and strategy games, so kind of what's considered mid-core in the mobile space. And my job is to kind of run both the day-to-day operations of the studio in terms of actually making games and and then just more strategically managing our product portfolio. So yeah, I've been making games a long time, and like I said, I love the hands-on part of it. I love kind of getting in there and struggling with all the questions of like what to make, how to make it. And I think, like Henry said, it's a hit-driven business, so your batting average is always going to be, under 500 probably, even if you're good. So you're never done learning in this game.
Gotcha. All right. Well, there's a wealth of knowledge here I'm excited to tap into. So let's get started kind of bird's eye view, like state of the mobile games industry. What are some of the recent trends that we've been seeing in the mobile game space? Oh, anyone can take it. Sorry, I didn't know if I should assign.
Go ahead, Henry. You can kick it off. I know Henry's got a lot to say here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're a good complement as we were talking about this panel, because I think I've tended to focus more on macro trends, in my time, in the industry, and Matt's been much more in the on the ground with specific products. So yeah, look, I think that there's a lot happening right now. I mean, the last year has been a wild one for mobile. It's been incredible to see the growth over the past decade, and even prior to that, but in the past year, things have accelerated considerably, as for obvious reasons in the pandemic. But I think just speaking a little bit more specifically about what I'm seeing, I think the big are getting bigger. Consolidation is certainly a thing where you're seeing the likes of Zynga and Playtika and Scopely and other companies like that start to really be more acquisitive. And to pick up some of the smaller up and coming companies, because I think what the recognition is that a lot of the best content are coming from the Purblues of the world, the studios that are relatively small and focus groups, making great games. Yet at the same time, many of them desire greater scale and infrastructure behind them. So I think that's one trend that I'm certainly seeing on my side. I think we're also seeing another thing that I'm noticing, and this speaks a little bit to what I'm doing currently at One Team Partner. We work with FIFA and Madden on the console side, and obviously there's a mobile business there, and one that I think has a lot of growth potential, as evidenced by more games that maybe even 3 to 5 years ago no one would have thought would work on mobile. Call of Duty, Fortnite, etc. Really starting to come to market in some very exciting ways, and I think changing the dynamic that in the way that people interact with their mobile devices, also opening up the eyes of many big publishers and IP holders as to what the possibilities are on mobile. So I think we're starting to see the technology really catch up with where the products can be, and my hope and belief is that we're going to start to see some really exciting new products, new game mechanics come to market on mobile in the next few years.
Yeah, totally agree. And I know I read one report that said mobile gaming just spend alone is supposed to hit 100 billion for 2020. So I mean, COVID definitely accelerated this trend, but like you said, Henry, like this has been growing for a while. Mobile, you can do incredible things in mobile games these days.
I think when guys like Matt and I got into mobile years ago, at least I'll speak for myself, 2012, it was pretty obvious that the tides were going to rise and that this was going to continue growing. I mean, you didn't need a lot of data to understand that, but I'll speak for myself. I didn't think that mobile would become the biggest, sector of games and by a decent margin. And I think, it's just going to continue. The games industry is very healthy on the whole, but the trajectory of the growth of mobile has just been astounding.
Yes. Yeah, there's a good visualization going around. I think it's on Visual Capitalist, which is a good site for just information visualization in general, but it shows, so people probably know, but gaming is bigger than music and film combined, and it has been for a while, and it kind of shows the growth of gaming over time, and you can see how the growth of the mobile category within gaming has just been monstrous in the last decade, and I don't know, well more than half of all gaming revenues come from mobile right now. So if you kind of go, where we're at in the world right now with the pandemic and that people are seeking entertainment, within entertainment, gaming is the biggest, and then within gaming, mobile is the biggest slice of that pie. And then a couple of my bits of color on trends in mobile right now. Yes, there's definitely a lot of consolidation. I think I don't totally know our audience here in the webinar, but you tend to either be in gaming on kind of more the publishing side or the developer side. And like Henry said, I think the publishers, you're a bigger company, you're trying to grow your business. If you're a public company, you've got your earnings reports and you're trying to show growth and scale. And a lot of the mobile games from the bigger publishers kind of came up through, like a Zynga was good in casual games for a while, and now they're trying to do different kinds of games. Well, gaming is so mature and complex right now. You want to go make an RPG as a Zynga or whatever. It's hard to do that from scratch, build a whole team out, within that thing. And it usually takes, years to mature a team or a studio to kind of get to the level of competency where they're best in the world and they're going to be cranking out a top 100 or top 50 grossing game. So I think that's why those studios have gotten more acquisitive, as they're going and finding those specialists in the marketplace. I think on the developer side, it's always good to know that there are people out there who want to acquire you, and if you're really good, but it's also very hard if you're, traditionally studios are not publishers. So if you're somebody who knows how to make a game, it's more and more the case that that's not enough, right? You have to know a lot about marketability, about performance-based user acquisition, about scaling and live ops and all this stuff. So all of the kind of infrastructure you need to make a hit game has gotten bigger and more complex. So I think, the studios are also looking to the publishers for that help. So there's kind of a good match on both sides right now.
And you might have touched on that a little bit there, Matt, because I think we're going to get into it now because we're going to talk about Unity in a second. But would you say, in aggregate, before we get into that, is it harder for the smaller players to survive and thrive nowadays as opposed to a few years ago, or is it's too difficult to kind of make that assumption?
I think it's definitely harder, but I think another kind of macro point is that mobile, because it's, any industry that gets really big gets more heterogeneous as it grows. And the difference between making, say, a hyper casual game versus, Activision putting out Call of Duty mobile, they're almost like two completely different kinds of games. The Call of Duty game is probably more similar to running a console game where you've got a team with hundreds of people and a budget that's in the tens of millions of dollars, and a hyper casual game might be, something you're putting out in 3 to 6 months, and you've got a kind of a shoestring budget and just a couple people working on it. So I think that latter case is kind of more what mobile used to be like when Henry was saying when we kind of got into the business, but now it's really heterogeneous, and there's still those like breakout opportunities for the people with the small team and doing something that, just doesn't take a lot of time and money to get to market. But I think they're definitely harder to break through now. You see a lot less movement in the top grossing charts, but because the pie has grown so much more too, what the top grossing charts is reflecting is, these are billion-dollar games now. When you look at a game like Pokemon Go or something, so if you're in a smaller studio and you want to make a few $100,000 and grow your studio, you don't need to be, a top 100 grossing game anymore. So that's kind of a roundabout answer of saying it depends. It depends a lot on like where you are in the ecosystem.
Definitely. The bigger players definitely are getting far bigger, making more money, but there's also, like you said, there's far more genres that require different levels of team size, obviously money to build them and that kind of thing. So it seems like it's a little bit of both, like you were saying. It's easier to get into games, but it might also be, there's more money in it, but it might also be a little bit harder.
I think if I can add one thing to that, I think it's a similar trend to what we've seen happen over a longer time horizon in, say, the movie industry. Where the middle gets squeezed out really because the middle gets gobbled up by the big boys once they emerge into the middle, and it's really hard. Look, there are not a lot of purviews. There's not a lot of studios that have been able to maintain independence successfully. And Purple is a fantastic studio, and I'm not just saying that. And really, operate on their own at kind of that scale. A lot of those studios do get gobbled up in some form, or kind of get in over their head and can't sustain. But to Matt's point, when someone asks me like, oh, it's impossible to succeed, how do you compete with these guys? Well, yeah, but the top grossing game used to make, like when I started at Scopely, like Clash of Clans was making, maybe, I don't know, a few $1,000,000 a month. Now we're talking a few $1,000,000 a day, and so it's just a totally different scale. And so you don't need to be in the top 100 grossing to have a viable business, especially if you're a dozen guys, and maybe even not in the most expensive part of the world. Well, then, you can have a top 500 grossing game and actually have a business out of it that makes sense. Oh, there's ad-driven games now, which weren't really a thing at scale, a decade ago. So there are different opportunities that exist for the smaller players. I think that middle section is really the most challenged spot.
Gotcha. Oh yeah, thanks for adding that, Henry. Let's shift and talk about Unity for a little bit. They recently IPO'd. They're crushing it in the mobile game space. From your guys' perspective, like what are some of the benefits of working with Unity when making mobile games? Anyone can take it. Henry, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, so first of all, it's a great tool. It's a really strong engine. There's a lot of modifications you can make to it if you want to soup it up. You know, Scopely uses it in all of their games, with some exception for some of the older titles that were just built a very long time ago. But even some of those have been transferred over to Unity. I mean, from my perspective, you know, one of the key benefits of Unity, I mean, you know, there's obviously the cross-platform component, but you know, free-to-play mobile games and really just free-to-play games or games in general have just a considerably longer life cycle than they used to. And so you're seeing games like, say, take, you know, Scopely's longest standing title, Yahtzee, which is, you know, at this point, 8, 9 years old, if you trace it all the way back to its origin as Dice with Buddies, you know, and eventually became Yahtzee with Buddies. You know, that is not something that really you had to take into consideration, you know, in the early 2000s in terms of how games were being made, played, and monetized. So when you think about a 10-year life cycle of a game, there's a lot of turnover if it stays with the same team. You know, it's unlikely that you're going to keep the same group of people working on it for 10 years. You know, there's a lot of growth. There's even the potential to move a game through a studio to different teams or to different teams externally, you know, depending on the life cycle of the game. Unity allows you to do that because it's a common language that, you know, developers understand. It's easy to hire for. People are learning it in schools these days. It's an accessible tool set that doesn't require necessarily the depth of engineering knowledge that you know, writing, say, writing code in a proprietary C++ engine does. So it's very flexible in that way from an operational standpoint. And, you know, for a publisher, you know, it's very difficult unless you have really invested in your own tech and you have a setup where you do all development in-house to work on other engines. I mean, Unreal would be the other one to talk about, but that's a whole other level of complexity, and generally, you know, is a little bit harder to access. Unity is sort of just the common language that, you know, when I started at Scopely, I used to ask, hey, what is your tech stack look like? You know, what are you writing in your client? And you know, I'd say it was mostly Unity, and this is like 2012. And then a few years into it, it was like, you don't even ask that. I would get surprised sometimes when someone would say, oh, by the way, you know, we're actually working in a different engine. So I think it's just become kind of.
You put your little secret X, you put a secret X mark on there of like, uh-oh, that's a red flag, you know.
Exactly.
But it's true, yeah. It used to be everybody asked that question because everybody had a slightly different tech stack. So that's just another kind of, you know, product of the maturation of the market, and Unity is as you know, risen to the top as the leader there. So it's you know, a lot of my main points are very similar to Henry's. I literally have common language written down in my notes as like the biggest, you know, upside of Unity. Because I'm not an engineer, so looking at things from a product perspective, it's, you know, you're often in a situation where you're thinking about, do I want to buy a game as a way to get into a market faster, acquire a team and or a game? You know, if you just acquire the game, you need to know how that tech works. So you don't want to spend, you know, at PerBlue, we actually sold one of our games and it wasn't in Unity, and I think that was it was a successful sale on both sides, but there was a lot of work to be done just to understand what our engineers had built, because it's essentially, you know, boutique custom code that, you know, you're buying. I can't think of a great analogy. It's if I built my own car from scratch and sold it to you, and then you had to, you know, do maintenance on it. It's like, you know, there's no manual for it or anything. Can't take it to you know, to a mechanic and have someone else work on it. So I think that's changed the, you know, and Henry, you're talking about this, just changed the amount of fluidity there can be with games as they age, and as, you know, games are now services. They're not just products anymore. They live a long time. So, you know, I was kind of talking about how heterogeneous the space is. That's not just from a genre perspective. You know, mobile used to be, oh, you just go there to play casual games like Candy Crush, and now you've got these big, you know, Genshin Impact and Call of Duty. But it's also a life cycle thing. You know, you've got games that are 10 years old, you got games that are brand new, things that are in like closed beta, and the consumer sees that. But I think even more on the developer side, there's more and more specialization where, you know, maybe a studio is really good at building stuff, but they're not great at scaling it. Or you've got a company that's, you know, like Scopely, that's just fantastic at scaling games. Or there are even companies that specialize in harvesting games, and they take really old games and they buy them and find ways to, you know, kind of manage them as late services. But having Unity affords all that, and it allows people to, to really hone in on what they're good at, because the actual skill sets that are required in those different life cycles are very different. So, in the past, it was like when no one else could use your code, it's like, well, we have to run all these skill sets and build out all this stuff, and it becomes difficult. So again, it's just a lot of these are all symptoms of a maturing market and greater specialization.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking off what you were just talking about, Matt, and earlier about we have a huge growth in larger players and smaller players, and sort of an erosion of the middle tier players.
Mm-hmm.
Having a standardized game building tool set like Unity probably lets you get that MVP out the door faster than if everyone was building their own custom game engine or figuring out all the quirks for themselves.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that, and Henry, I'd be curious on your thoughts here, but I'm seeing a trend with other studios, especially around our size, where we don't make a lot of games each year, so we only have a couple shots on goal. So we really want to get things in the market fast because we want to validate product market fit as soon as possible. The more time and money and energy you invest in something before you actually find out if really basic questions like, people like this? Do they think the art looks dumb, or are the CPIs going to be off the charts so we just can't scale this game? Is if you're trying a new core game mechanic, like, is it fun? Those are hard things to measure internally. So without external market validation on those things quickly, you put yourself in a precarious position as a small studio. So something like Unity really allows you to get to market quickly and find that stuff out.
Totally agree with that. Yeah, I think, in the old days, and by old days, I mean 8 years ago, I
Which
think
is
that there
forever.
was, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Before any kind of global pandemic or, people were, using Zoom all the time, Unity wasn't necessarily always up to snuff for every studio as well. I think was a challenge. You'd hear about, we're making a certain kind of a game. Unity just doesn't perform on device. We want to go native. Unity's done an incredible job getting their product, really to be A level. So you can use it for just about any game, 2D, 3D, making a 2D game, Unity's really hard to make. No, that's not the case anymore. We originally, Dice with Buddies was a game that was built native to each platform. We had an Android team and an iOS team, working on it. I mean, talk about inefficiency, multiple SKUs. It was just crazy. Unity allowed us to bring that together. We believe it or not, performance actually matters a tremendous amount in an extremely simple game like Yahtzee. Actually, maybe in some ways more than a more complex game, because you're getting a lot of unqualified users coming through, and you want to give them this quick hitting, really great experience. So we cared so much about the way the thing played on device. Took us a few years, but finally we got there when we saw great results in a lot of our other products, which were being built, from scratch in Unity, where we actually decided, despite it being a very, very painful process and a very risky process, when you've got, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of DAU on an actual game that you're trying to transfer over to a new game engine. A lot of fancy footwork there, a lot of strategic thinking, but we did it because the benefits and the efficiencies once we came through on the other side were just huge. So I think Unity is it's a really strong engine right now. So it's sort of like, you got to question, well, why would you do anything else? Like, you really have to have a reason, and there's usually not a good one.
Yeah. And like you guys were saying, if someone mentions they're not building on Unity, that brings up a list of several questions you have for them, as opposed to the other way around a few years ago. Let's move on. Let's talk about teams, the importance of the team in making a mobile game. So what are some of the things that you guys look for in the teams that you work with? Anyone can go. I started with you, Henry, last time. How about Matt? Would you like
All
to
right,
go
I'll
first?
start. I'll start on this one. Yeah, and I think Henry and I have a lot of similar thoughts on this one too, because we've seen a lot of teams over the years, and the team is everything. Like the people making the game is everything, because gaming is, even though it's become more and more commercial, it's still this alchemy of like art and science. And it's a very collaborative process. It's also very complicated. It has probably gotten more complicated as you layer in all these different considerations around a live service. So you just need a team that is, has a lot of talent on it, works well together, and executes well together. And I think a lot of times that takes several cycles to get to. So, you know, you got to kind of go in clear-eyed when you have a new team. And usually I consider the first product a new team makes is like, just assume that's not going to be successful. It's safer that way. You know, you don't like, we talk about like stacking risk a lot when you're making new products. Like you kind of look across the product and you look at the theme, the mechanics, the monetization, the team, the technology. It's like you want to have maybe risk in one of those areas, but once you start having risk in multiples of those areas, so you know, you have a brand new team, you put them on something really well. Like new teams usually go for us on our live games, right? Let's go learn in the trenches, learn how a live game works, learn what it's like to have, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of customers playing your game every day, get really upset, you know, if things break and they want it fixed right away. I mean, that's a whole kind of, you know, way of just learning how to run a business. You do that, and then you know you put your most senior people on your new stuff, where you're getting creative and you're trying new tech and new mechanics and stuff, and you trust them to, you know, leverage all their expertise to make good games.
Yeah, I totally agree. Matt and I come from a similar mindset on this one. I'll add that when I look at teams, and especially, you know, from kind of a publisher licensor standpoint, which are, you know, the hats that I've typically worn, you know, we're looking for a team that can be the best in the world in something, you know, and ideally we can really support that in other ways. Thinking about a publisher perspective, Scopely's perspective on this, and many others, I know it's like, you know, a team that's just kind of decent across the board doesn't really do anything for you. That's not the way you're going to create separation from others in the market. But if you can find a team that, hey, these guys could be the best technical artists in the world, well, okay, yeah, they need help understanding free-to-play mechanics, but we're going to make something that sings on device and is going to be awesome. You know, like you can figure that one out versus, yeah, they're pretty good artists, they're decent at monetization, and they got decent back-end engineering. You know, it's sort of like, you know, to use a sports analogy, because I'm a sports guy and I can't go, you know, 20 minutes without making a baseball analogy. I mean, it's like the 5-tool player in baseball, you know, maybe once in a generation you find your Mike Trout, but you know, it's so hard to find that it's a unicorn hunt if that's all you're looking for. You might as well find a guy. I mean, you can build a lineup if you get the best power hitter, the best, you know, guy who can lead the league in average, someone who can really run. Maybe they've got 2 of the 5 tools, you know, but they don't have them all. But that's how you build a winning team, because you're able to sort of complement, you know, the core skill set of the star with the others around them. And so that's really sort of how I always approached, you know, partnerships in the development space.
Very interesting. And so you mentioned that kind of outside of the genre of the game that a given team is making, that if they're very good at specific aspects of it, would you find yourself, Henry, in that situation, kind of leveraging a team's strength like on separate games? Like how does it work in terms of using them outside of what they're working on? Yeah.
Well, genre expertise could be one of those things, by the way, right? Like I think genre expertise, you could have a studio, you know, Per Blue is a great example, and say like, wow, these guys really get RPGs, you know, like they could be amongst the best in the world at RPG game development, you know, so I think that is certainly could be one of those areas, just to make that clear. I think different publishers, different studios, you know, operate differently. You know, my mindset on that one is really, you know, really comes back to focus. You know, it's not really a development team as much as like maybe a services team of different, you know, engineers and designers and product folks when they're working on a bunch of different projects, right? Then it's sort of like, oh, that's like a back-end group, and like we deploy and they're a back-end and they touch all the different products that maybe they're working on the platform for the company, whatever it is. When I say team, I do mean kind of the soup to nuts, you know, game development team that is bringing a product to life and running it. So I think, you know, different parts of the world even have different definitions of what a team looks like, and in different ways of you know, maybe using different teams during different stages of the product. I think typically in the West, you're seeing teams that build a game, run a game post-launch, at least for a period of time, before I think sometimes it gets taken over by another group or moved over within the studio or sold or whatever it might be.
Gotcha. Let's switch topics a little bit right now to observability. So what are some of the things that you want to keep track of on an ongoing basis at the team and the game level in order to spot like problems or areas that could be improved? Why don't we start with, went to Matt last time. Henry, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so look, every game and every genre is different. The things you're going to need to pay attention to is kind of some opposite extremes. You know, if you're making a hyper casual game, you know, it's going to feel and look very different from a day-to-day operation standpoint than it will if you're making, you know, a 4X MMO, you know. So I think, you know, it's all case by case, but I think that a theme that is important regardless of the type of game you're making is communication and transparency. And what that means from a process standpoint oftentimes is actually having a process and actually having, you know, tools that everybody uses reliably and communication channels that are consistent across the organization. If you can combine that with a real honest approach, because I think it's very sometimes hard to be honest in such a chaotic world of you know, wanting to make the next big hit and having, you know, multiple layers potentially above you within an organization and reporting and all that. If you can have communication and honesty, then that prevents a lot of problems. And from a development standpoint, to me, feels a lot like the type of observability that you want. I mean, it sounds so silly to say, but I can't tell you how many times, you know, I've realized, you know, later than I should have that, wait, why can't this thing scale to 1 million daily active users? Like why didn't, oh, well, we had this tech debt and we were pushing this other feature and all that. Well, if it was communicated properly and people were actually really honest about it, and there was I think sort of a baseline of trust and accountability that, yeah, okay, we're behind in one certain area, but that doesn't mean you're failing or you're losing your jobs. That means that you ran into headwinds, and that's, hey, welcome to game development. It's not easy, you know, and there's always unknowns. So I think that's what I would lean into, you know, is really an element of communication and transparency.
Yeah, that's a good, you know, the observability can mean a lot of different things. I think there's kind of observability within, you know, Henry, at Scopely, you guys had a lot of different studios and a lot of, you know, communication across the different individual teams building games and people who are kind of in the middle and orchestrating all that. And it gets complex. And, you know, like I was saying, game development's very collaborative. So that of kind of team type of observability is very critical. I think on the product observability, you know, I'm sure people are familiar with like gaming being very data driven these days, and I think nowhere more so than in mobile games. You want observability at all level of your games. You know, we talk about KPIs, key product indicators that are kind of the highest level. You know, you're looking at your retention, your revenue, your customer acquisition costs is kind of like the big things. But it's, you know, there's a lot of ways to come at this. I tend to think of it as kind of, you want validation at every step, and it's kind of concentric circles as you go out. You know, in the beginning, I was talking about with a new game, you want validation on just the product market fit, and then you start to get a little bit of that, you know, and then you get more into like longer term retention, and everything kind of trees downward. You know, like as you get into early retention, you're looking for data on like how fast is your game boot, you know, how performant is like your onboarding, how good is your tutorial. You know, we were talking about tech stuff before with Unity. I mean, there are a lot of things like you're looking at both like how much do the players kind of understand what's going on versus like how much are they running into bugs and crashes and lags and that kind of thing. So there's these layers of, you know, retention, and then it's early retention, it's the tutorial, and then I'm looking at, you know, kind of behavioral stuff and data oriented stuff. So you kind of need all that, you know. And I think one challenge is also, which I think Henry is also getting at too, is like how do you surface that to the team and make sure people, you know, don't get overwhelmed in the data. And that's probably a whole other conversation about about how to do that. I think there's some good tools out there now that kind of make reporting and dashboarding and stuff a lot easier. You know, in the old days, it was always like the producers and product managers are writing their own SQL code to query the database directly and figure out what the hell's going on. And now there's a lot more of a kind of built out tool sets and even job, you know, roles in BI that facilitate all that. But yeah, it's a
Look, there's
another sort of
we're,
complex
we're in the
problem.
age. Yeah, there's never going to be a shortage of data anymore. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, yeah. So again, I
And
mean, focus
yeah,
is really important, right? Like just like we're saying with building product, you got to know, you got to always be asking yourself questions about what's the most important thing to look at right now, and go to that thing and make sure you don't get kind of distracted by all the other stuff, and that you then, I think another big step is the data tells you what's going on, but doesn't tell you why. So there's a lot of qualitative insights that you have to use to bolster what you're observing to actually make decisions on what to do, and that can come from expertise, but actually interacting directly with your community and players is where you often get that why as well.
yeah, I think a lot of what Matt's talking about is the beauty of mobile games, which, as he said earlier, and I oftentimes say this, is a marriage of art and science. Because you still need that artistry to establish sort of the feel of a game that generates those KPIs, but you have the ability to test in real time and identify, exactly what user behavior looks like, which is so different than the old days of really any form of media. A bunch of people who are oftentimes incredibly smart, talented, experienced sit in a room and decide what to make and then put it somewhere for people to consume. It's just so totally different. I would even go so far, bringing it back to some of the earlier points about trends in the industry. This is why consolidation is such a thing right now, because I personally believe that good companies should never do quote unquote bad M&A anymore. What does bad M&A look like? And no offense to people involved in something, like this, but like EA goes and buys PopCap for $750 million, years ago. A lot of really talented, really amazing people from PopCap, by the way. So nothing against that organization, but they were buying it effectively on the thesis of, hey, they made this Plants vs. Zombies thing, like, they made this Peggle thing. These guys make great games. They got more in the tank. Now Zynga goes and buys Small Giant, and they're like, okay, they've put 1,000 boxes through a factory and put product in it and sold it to someone. We can model this out. We see it. What if we put 2,000 boxes through the factory? Will that work? Like, it's so much more scientific of an analysis. Yes, of course, there's a qualitative element to it, but the qualitative element has to answer to the quantitative side. So I think that is why I spent the first half of my career in more of the traditional media industry and film and TV and advertising, traditional. And it was so refreshing to come to mobile, where it was like your opinions could be validated. And then at the end of the day, even if you disagreed, you were either right or wrong for the most part. And yes, you can make data say a lot of different things, but if you're looking at it holistically and honestly, you can usually come out with a good sense of agreement on what's actually happening.
Yeah, it's a far less defensible position now to rely on the good old hunch.
Yep.
So I want to touch on something, Matt, you brought up. You brought up revenue versus retention when you were talking about KPIs, and I'm sure those who are attending who work in mobile games will relate to this. It's a never-ending battle between what you're trying to optimize for. Do we try to just keep people around? Do we try to like make more money from them? How do we balance this? In your guys' experience, which is more important for teams and game companies to focus on, revenue or retention? Henry, would you like to go first?
I have a strong take on this, but I'll preface it by saying that it all depends on your goals and where you are in your overall business cycle. But if I was a studio starting out right now, trying to make some noise in the market and eventually scale, whether that's independently or via an acquisition or partnership, I would be focused squarely on retention. It is first of all really hard to create a game that retains extremely well, which is why it's such a sought after trait. But the monetization side of it is much more of the science. There are tools, and I don't want to say tricks, but there are tactics that can be employed on a game that has users that are hanging out in there. And if you have engagement and you have people who are of their own volition spending time with your product, then you're going to have the ability to take a bunch of swings and actually figure out a way to monetize them. The opposite is not true. If you have a game that monetizes really well but no one wants to spend time in it, you're going to end up likely with a small user base, and you're going to have a lot of people funneling through and not sticking around. And that's a much more dangerous game and less defensible position to be in. So, you know, I look at it and, you know, I kind of am in the mindset of, we'll figure out the monetization. It's certainly not that simple, so I do not mean to trivialize it. But you know, gone are the days where monetization and free to play is kind of seen as like a dark art that only a handful of people, you know, and a lot of those people happen to be in Asia. Now you have a lot of people, given the growth of the industry, that understand, you know, the tactics and approaches that are necessary to monetizing an audience. But what they need is an engaged audience. And so, you know, how do you get that engagement? How do you get people coming back? If you can do that, you know, the rest follows. So that is for me the most important thing in any game.
Yeah, there's not much to add to that. That's very, very well said. I think that's 100% true. We actually have so part of my job is to run the studio, but as a small studio, I'm also leading one of the game teams, and we have a game in soft launch right now. And you know, it's early in soft launch, so you know, we're in a couple Nordic countries with a new RPG, and you know, retention. I'm not even worried about monetization right now. The monetization features on my roadmap. Again, it's not like not worried at all. I want to see a baseline level of monetization there that says that people are willing to spend money in this game. You know, if there was kind of no money at all, I think that's a certain element of like, you know, some of the early monetization generated games, just people voting with their dollars that they enjoy the game, and maybe kind of less due to how much kind of overt monetization systems you maybe really have going. You know, like we have, for example, battle passes that we want to add to the game, and we know those are going to drive revenue in the game, but that wasn't like the first thing that needs to go in the game. You know, we actually don't have PvP in there yet. So like I'm much more concerned about PvP, because it's kind of table stakes for a good RPG, and you want to make sure the PvP is fun, that it's really creates competition, which is a thing that drives revenue in an indirect way, but often more effectively than, you know, another kind of sale or kind of direct tactic. So that's kind of some of the thought process, you know, in thinking about a roadmap of a game is, you know, you're again building concentric circles. Like for us, it's like get the game out. You know, RPGs tend to have like a bunch of heroes. You got to have enough heroes. You got to have enough campaign, which is your PvE that you go play through, that people are gonna play that and show some retention numbers, and then you start layering in things and trying to build up. Let's get through, you know, the mid to late retention stronger, and then, you know, monetization, blah blah blah. I think the other point I would make too is that I think the third pillar of that stool for mobile games is the marketability piece. And you know, as a small studio, you know, we were fortunate enough to work with Disney on our last game, but we're not, you know, it's not like every game we're making is Marvel and Star Wars. Marketability is very tricky, and there's even within that a kind of blend of alchemy of art and science there, because, you know, I always say that mobile games is like making pop music. So you have to kind of, I think a lot of people come to mobile gaming jobs as I'm a gamer, you know, and I play all the stuff, you know, I'm playing, you know, like, well, what's a good nerdy game that, trying to think of one that just came out. Anyway, I can't Hades. I'm playing Hades at home, which is like, you know, the Bastion Transistor team is like great game, right? But like doesn't have much to do with a commercially successful mobile product. So you really have to understand how to make something that is very familiar to people, and that they feel super comfortable with, but is different enough that it's going to hook them in. And I think that often is a very difficult thing for people to wrap their head around. It's easy to copy stuff, and it's also really easy to go off and make something that ends up being so boutique and so niche that there's nobody that wants to play it. So yeah.
And like in Hollywood, because I know, Henry, you mentioned working there, right? It's that old adage of give me the same thing but different. Or
Right,
is it similar?
right.
Give me similar.
Why are they making another buddy cop movie? You know, it's like if it's bad, that's the question you ask. You're like, oh, it's just another buddy cop movie. But if it's good, you know, it's
a fresh take.
I love these kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I caught wind of Purblue for the first time. This predates you, Matt. You know, and the stuff you're making now looks a lot better than this, so I don't want to embarrass you at all. But but greed for glory. I mean, that was basically
Not a
a
good looking
Clash
game.
of clone, not a good looking game, but a game that played well, and a game that was on a platform, Android, which is, this is so crazy. I can't even believe this was a thing. It didn't have Clash of Clans yet. You know, Supercell hadn't brought Clash of Clans to Android, and all of a sudden you guys had a game that was doing real revenue that, you know, was sort of, yeah, it was like the indie version of it, but it was something that people wanted. You know, it's like, you know, I once heard a designer say, a mobile games designer, not surprisingly, when we were talking about creative ideas and new IP generation on an engine that we already owned, and you know, it was a mid-core game type, and you know, he was driving towards making a fantasy type of a game, and everyone was like, "There's all these fantasy games, it's bloody water," and he's like, "Look, if I'm selling sports cars, don't tell me I can't sell red sports cars. That's what people want, you know, like." So yeah, I'll sell some yellow and blue ones, but people want red sports cars. So that's and there's a reason there's so many fantasy games in the RPG and, you know, MMO space.
Yep.
We
Very well said.
our previous RPG we made, we went the sci-fi route and we tried to thread the needle because we kind of knew we were going up against a competitor that already had a fantasy game. And even in that scenario, I feel like looking back on it, if I had to do it over, I would have made another fantasy game. It's like, so explicitly our goal for our next couple games this year was like fantasy. That's what works well in midcore.
Gotcha.
Matt mentioned marketability, and I'll just circle back to that really quickly because I think retention is the number one KPI to look at. But if there was another one that's like a rare breed, and again, this is one of those, like, how do you build something like that? It's testing and intuition and validation. But if you can create something that drives organic installs and has organic interest, like, that's about as valuable as retention, because retention is sort of like making the bucket less leaky. Driving organics is like finding a beach full of sand that you can just constantly pour into it. So it kind of doesn't matter if your bucket's really leaky. So they're sort of like, are the top or the bottom. And those two things, it's like, you know, again, sorry, another sports analogy, but you know, you're drafting for speed. Like when you're in the NFL draft and you see someone who runs the 4.3 40, a wide receiver, you're like, I'm going to get that guy because I can teach him to run routes. You know, you're not going to get to the guy who runs the 4.6, who's the great route runner, and teach him how to be a faster runner. That doesn't work that way. And that's retention and marketability for me, is speed.
Gotcha. And one way you can help drive organic installs and people discovering your game through word of mouth is making a game that people love. So kind of this is a great segue into our next topic, which is customer satisfaction, right? We want to make games that people want to play and like playing. So what are some of the things game companies can do to make sure that they're making their customers happy, like the people that play their games? Matt, would you like to kind of go first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I kind of like all the stuff we're talking about. This is another one where things have evolved a lot, you know, over the years. And because gamers are, so we were talking about how the market's got more sophisticated, the publishers, developers, the gamers have as well, right? Both in that you didn't see people playing Call of Duty on mobile 10 years ago, but also, like, you know, in what we do in RPGs, a person's going to pick up our game, play it for a few minutes and be like, you know, I've played a bunch of mobile RPGs. I've probably, if I'm a serious player, I've invested maybe hundreds of dollars in one or two of them, the things that I like. I know what I want, you know, and I want, so it's kind of, you know, kind of like your sports car analogy there, Henry. You got somebody who walks into the Ferrari dealership, you got to treat that person right and understand what that person wants in order to get them to commit to your game as something they're going to spend, you know, hours every week, over months, and even years in. It's a hobby for a lot of people that are serious players. So it helps to, you know, I've been in that boat before. I've been in serious guilds and dropped hundreds of dollars on games. Like, you want people in your company that have that mentality from the consumer perspective. And then you need to do things like, we use Playtest Cloud as just one of the services, but we did a lot of play testing in pre-soft launch for our games to get users to play through. So you're doing like user testing, kind of focus groupy type stuff. With live games, we've got forums, stay really active. You have dedicated people on those forums that are talking to players, and they're you know, playing the game a lot. Do things like ask me anything type of you know, regular, we call them dev chats. So we do regular dev chats. When the game's small, we do them live in the game, like in beta, just like hop in chat and talk to the players and ask them what they like, what they don't like. There's all kinds of things. I mean, you need a good ticketing system for customer support, and that's kind of evolved a lot in how that all works. Trying to think of it. Discord is a huge part of the ecosystem now for communicating with players. I think most games have kind of tiers, right? Where there's like anybody can put a ticket in, you're looking for bugs. The next tier up is like you've got forums and people kind of talk in there, more specialized groups. And then you start to get into kind of, more like VIP service level of like, hey, the top players, top guild leaders, top spenders, whatever, there's a special Discord over here and you have access to the developers and you can ask them questions. And, if you're a small game, you should do all that right away because the more consumer feedback, player feedback you get, the better. But usually in like bigger games, it starts to get more tiered just because of the resources that's required for that more kind of velvet glove type of approach. But I mean, people sometimes ask me like for a game that I'm working on, well, like what's the roadmap 6 months out? And, I always have an idea, but sometimes I just say like, well, it depends, because we're going to put this feature out and then we're going to see what the players have to say about it. And just like games are services, even individual features within a game are a service. So what you think, your guild versus guild war feature is going to be like, the initial thing is usually kind of like 50%, 60% right, 80% if you're lucky, but then the players are actually going to tell you how to steer it. And it's going to take multiple iterations of that feature to actually get it where it's the right balance of like what you need for the business and what the players want. So that dance is very much a part of the kind of creating that scale and that long-term success of a service.
Yeah, that's great. That a tremendous amount there, and I agree with all of it. The only thing I would add is, which I think is a kind of a, almost a foundational idea to a lot of what Matt just said, is the idea of personalization and making the game feel really like it's catered to the user. I mean, the cool thing about these devices is that they're the most personal device that has really ever existed, because 1 minute you're texting with your significant other, the next minute you are looking at photos from 5 years ago, and the next minute you're getting a push notification from your favorite sports team, company, organization, whatever, and then you're going onto your self-curated Twitter feed to see what everyone's saying. So you need to kind of keep that in mind when creating experiences, whether it's, I think, the sort of bare minimum of it is finding ways to be smart about segmenting audiences and sending certain notifications or messaging to specific player sets. I think, when it gets really advanced, and I think we actually are still in the early days of this on mobile, and there's so much more that can be done. It's literally like, I can imagine a world in which, let's take Yahtzee, for example, a person enters and Scopely knows, well, this person really only likes playing with their friends. And you don't see anything else. You literally don't see tournaments. You don't see, store may not be surfaced in the same way. Like you just see PvP and you're pushed to playing with your friends, or someone be a very competitive tournament player and really obsessed about rewards and vanity or whatever, and like pushing them in a totally different direction, and you're literally seeing a different screen on devices. I think that's where this can head, and where it probably should head, to really create the optimal experience on a per user basis.
Yeah, that's very cool. How cool would that be that you could completely customize just how the game is for you based on your preferences? I would love that. I want to make sure we have time to get to some questions, some of our attendees' questions.
Sure.
So I'm just going to wrap this up with one final question for you guys, which is, what is your advice? If you had to give one piece of advice for a company that was starting out in mobile games, what would it be? Let's start with you, Matt.
I might steal Henry's because we talked about this already a little bit, but we kind of have the same thing, going back to, so from the perspective of somebody starting a mobile game team, you're going to create a game. I think this whole like focus, innovate in one area and execute well in that area is the single most important thing you can do.
You gave me credit, so I mean that is mine. Focus is so key. So easy to try to do everything, try to make every kind of game you ever want to make. Decide what you could really be the best at and go deep in that area, and good things will typically follow.
Awesome. You've heard it from Henry and Matt people. There's only one piece of advice that mobile gaming companies ever need. No, I'm kidding. Thank you guys so much